I thought my parents had abandoned me in a hospital bed while they flew to Cancun with my brother, but what Eleanor Brooks didn't know that night was that someone had been quietly sitting beside her hospital bed every single evening. The room at St. Mary's Medical Center in Chicago was dim except for the soft green glow of the heart monitor beside her bed, and the steady rhythm of its beeping was the only thing breaking the silence after midnight. Eleanor Brooks, 68 years old, lay propped slightly upright against the thin hospital pillows, her silver hair brushed neatly back despite the fatigue still lingering from heart surgery 2 days earlier. Earlier that afternoon, she had forced a smile while speaking to her parents on the phone as they excitedly described turquoise water, warm beaches, and the oceanfront resort they had booked in Cancun. Her older brother Michael had convinced them to take the trip months earlier, and the departure date had arrived at the worst possible time, just hours after Eleanor had been admitted to the hospital. "Don't worry about me," she had said gently, keeping her voice calm so they wouldn't hear the exhaustion in it. "You've been planning that vacation for months. Go enjoy the sunshine." Her mother had hesitated for a moment before agreeing, and by that evening Eleanor had received a cheerful photo message of the three of them standing beside a bright blue swimming pool with palm trees behind them. Eleanor had stared at the picture for a long moment before setting the phone down on the hospital tray table. She told herself she understood. Everyone needed a break sometimes. Still, the room felt a little colder after that call ended. Around 10 o'clock that night, a young nurse named Ashley had come in to check Eleanor's blood pressure and adjust the 4-line. She worked quickly, but with the gentle efficiency that came from long night shifts. As she finished charting the numbers on her tablet, she smiled warmly and said something that made Eleanor's brow crease with confusion. "Your family seems really devoted," Ashley said. "Someone has been coming to see you every night." Eleanor blinked slowly, certain she had misheard. "Every night," she repeated quietly. "Yes," the nurse replied. "He usually comes late, sits by the window for a while, and checks that you're resting comfortably before he leaves." Eleanor's mind moved through the possibilities one by one. Her parents were already in Mexico. Michael had flown with them that morning. Her son Daniel lived nearly 800 miles away in Denver and hadn't mentioned traveling. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that there must have been a mistake. "Are you sure it was the right room?" Eleanor asked gently. Ashley nodded with confidence. "Room 412. Eleanor Brooks. I remember because he asked twice how your recovery was going." After the nurse left, Eleanor stared at the quiet room, listening to the steady hum of the ventilation system and the distant rolling of a cart down the hallway. She replayed the nurse's words again and again, trying to make sense of them. Someone had been visiting her every night, yet she had no memory of seeing anyone. Outside the window, the Chicago skyline glowed faintly in the distance, and somewhere far below a siren echoed along the street before fading away. Eleanor shifted slightly under the hospital blanket, her mind now fully awake despite the hour. If her family was relaxing under warm Caribbean stars, then who had been quietly walking into this hospital room after dark, sitting beside her bed, and leaving again before morning without saying a word? The next morning, the pale winter light over Chicago filtered through the tall hospital window and settled across the quiet room where Eleanor Brooks slowly opened her eyes. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The faint scent of antiseptic and the soft electronic rhythm from the heart monitor brought the memory back immediately. She was still in room 412 at St. Mary's Medical Center, recovering from the surgery that the cardiologist had insisted could no longer wait. Eleanor shifted carefully under the thin hospital blanket, feeling the dull heaviness in her chest that reminded her to move slowly. Outside the window, the city looked cold and distant, gray buildings stretching toward a pale sky, while traffic crawled along Lake Shore Drive several stories below. A nurse entered shortly after sunrise with a tray of oatmeal, black coffee, and a small cup of fruit that looked almost too bright against the sterile white table. Eleanor thanked her politely and tried to eat even though her appetite had not fully returned. While she stirred the oatmeal slowly, her mind returned to the words the night nurse had spoken only hours earlier. Someone had been coming to see her every night. The idea felt strange and unreal, like a puzzle with a missing piece. She tried to remember if she had heard the door open during the night or if she had sensed someone nearby while she slept, but the medication and exhaustion had wrapped the past few days in a soft fog. After breakfast, she reached for her phone on the tray table and opened the photo her mother had sent the previous afternoon. The picture showed bright sunlight reflecting off the turquoise water of a hotel pool while her parents and her brother Michael stood smiling with sunglasses and wide straw hats. Her father had written beneath the picture that the temperature was already 82 degrees and the ocean breeze felt wonderful. Eleanor looked at the image quietly for a long moment before locking the screen again. She did not feel angry. She had told them to go, and she meant it when she said they deserved a break. Still, the contrast between the warm beaches in the photograph and the quiet hospital room around her made the silence feel heavier than it had the day before. Late in the morning, a different nurse came in to check her pulse and adjust the intravenous line. Eleanor waited until the nurse finished charting the numbers before asking the question that had been circling in her thoughts since the night before. She asked whether the man who had been visiting had come again. The nurse smiled and said that she had heard about the visitor during the shift report. According to the staff, the man usually arrived late in the evening, spoke very little, and always asked how Eleanor was recovering before leaving quietly. The description was still vague, but the detail that caught Eleanor's attention was the way the nurse said he seemed deeply concerned about her health. Eleanor leaned back against the pillow after the nurse left, letting the steady rhythm of the monitor fill the room again. Someone had been coming here again and again while she slept, sitting beside her bed without announcing himself and leaving before morning. The idea stirred a quiet curiosity that slowly replaced the loneliness she had felt earlier. Whoever the visitor was, he clearly did not want attention or recognition. He simply wanted to make sure she was all right. As the afternoon passed, Eleanor began watching the hospital door more often, wondering if the mysterious visitor would appear while she was awake this time. The sun slowly drifted across the window, casting long shadows across the polished floor tiles, and with every passing hour the question grew stronger in her mind. If her family was thousands of miles away enjoying warm Caribbean nights, then who was the man who kept returning to this quiet hospital room after dark as though Eleanor Brooks mattered more to him than anyone realized? By the time evening settled over Chicago, the sky outside Eleanor Brooks's hospital window had turned the color of deep steel, and the distant lights of the city began to glow one by one as traffic moved slowly along the streets far below. The quiet of St. Mary's Medical Center felt different at night, softer and more reflective, as though the building itself was breathing more slowly after the rush of the day. Eleanor had spent most of the afternoon thinking about the mysterious visitor the nurses had mentioned, replaying every possibility in her mind and finding none that made sense. Her parents were thousands of miles away enjoying warm ocean air and white beaches, and her brother Michael had proudly sent another photo of the resort lobby where enormous glass windows overlooked the Caribbean Sea. Eleanor had responded with a simple message telling them she hoped the weather stayed perfect. She meant it sincerely. She had always believed that family should never feel guilty for enjoying life. Still, once the message was sent, the silence of the hospital room returned with a quiet weight that was difficult to ignore. Around 6 in the evening, a doctor stopped by to review her chart and explain that her recovery was progressing steadily. The surgery had gone well, and if everything continued at the same pace, she could likely return home within several days. Eleanor listened carefully, nodding politely and asking thoughtful questions the way she always had whenever doctors discussed medical details. After the doctor left, she watched the sunset fade slowly behind the skyline and felt a mixture of relief and fatigue settle into her chest. The medication made her eyelids heavy, but curiosity kept her mind awake. If someone truly had been visiting her every night, then perhaps tonight she would finally discover who it was. The hospital hallway gradually grew quieter as visiting hours ended and the evening staff changed shifts. A nurse came in to adjust the blankets and check the monitors before dimming the lights to help Eleanor rest. Soon the room was lit only by the soft glow of the machines beside her bed and the faint city lights outside the window. Eleanor pretended to relax as if she were drifting toward sleep, but her attention remained fixed on the closed door across the room. The minutes passed slowly, marked only by the steady rhythm of the monitor and the distant sound of a cart rolling along the hallway floor. At exactly 10:15 in the evening, the door handle turned gently. Eleanor felt her breath pause for a moment as the door opened just enough for a tall figure to step inside. The man moved quietly, almost respectfully, as though he did not wish to disturb the stillness of the room. He carried a small bouquet of fresh white lilies that he placed carefully on the table beside her bed before adjusting the chair near the window. Eleanor kept her eyes closed at first, listening as he settled into the chair and exhaled slowly. There was something calm about his presence, something familiar in the way he sat there quietly without speaking. After a few moments, she opened her eyes slightly and saw him clearly for the first time. The man appeared to be in his late 60s with neatly combed gray hair and a dark overcoat folded across the back of the chair. His expression was thoughtful as he glanced toward the heart monitor and then toward Eleanor's resting face. For a moment he seemed relieved simply to see the steady pattern of the machine beside her bed. Eleanor studied him carefully, searching her memory for recognition. The face stirred a distant sense of familiarity, like a name resting just beyond reach. The man leaned forward slightly and spoke in a low voice, almost to himself. He said that she seemed stronger tonight and that the doctors must be doing their job well. Hearing his voice stirred something deeper in Eleanor's memory. She opened her eyes fully this time and spoke softly into the quiet room, asking him why he had been visiting her every night without telling her he was there. The man looked up in clear surprise, his calm expression shifting as he realized she had been awake all along. For a brief moment neither of them spoke, and the steady sound of the heart monitor filled the silence between them as Eleanor Brooks waited to finally learn why this stranger had been returning to her hospital room after dark, as though he had been quietly guarding her recovery all along. The man remained still for a moment after Eleanor Brooks spoke, as though the quiet voice from the hospital bed had caught him completely off guard. The faint city light from the window behind him revealed a thoughtful face lined with years, but softened by a calm expression. For several seconds neither of them moved. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor continued to echo gently in the quiet room, filling the space between them while the man slowly placed his hands together as if deciding how to answer. Finally, he stood from the chair beside the window and stepped closer to the hospital bed, careful not to disturb the medical wires resting against Eleanor's arm. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm tone of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing his words carefully. He said that he had hoped she would continue resting without interruption and that he had not intended to wake her. Eleanor studied him closely as he stepped into the soft light from the bedside lamp. Now that he stood only a few feet away, the sense of familiarity grew stronger. The silver hair, the thoughtful eyes, even the quiet confidence in his posture stirred something deep in her memory. She searched through decades of faces and names, trying to place him. The man noticed the confusion in her expression and offered a small, respectful smile before introducing himself. He said that his name was Samuel Carter. The name settled into Eleanor's thoughts like a piece of a puzzle finally sliding into place. Samuel Carter had once been a business partner of her late husband Robert many years earlier, when Robert had been expanding his construction company across Illinois. The two men had worked together on several large projects during the early 1990s before their careers eventually moved in different directions. Eleanor remembered Samuel as a man who had visited their home for dinner a few times long ago, always polite and thoughtful, always speaking with quiet respect. Toward her husband. The memory returned slowly but clearly now that the name had been spoken. Eleanor asked gently why he had come to see her without saying anything during the past few nights. Samuel rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair beside the bed and explained that he had learned about her surgery from an old mutual friend who still followed the local business community. When he heard that Eleanor had been admitted to St. Mary's Medical Center, he felt a sense of responsibility to check on her. Robert had once helped him through a difficult financial moment early in his career, and Samuel had never forgotten that kindness. He said that visiting her had simply felt like the right thing to do. Eleanor listened quietly while he spoke, noticing the calm sincerity in his voice. It did not feel like the kind of explanation someone would invent quickly. Samuel continued by explaining that he had arrived late each evening because he did not want to interrupt the hospital staff during busy hours or disturb Eleanor while she was recovering from surgery. He had planned to sit quietly beside the window for a few minutes each night, check that her condition seemed stable, and then leave without waking her. Eleanor felt a small warmth rise in her chest as she listened to him describe those quiet visits. The idea that someone had been watching over her recovery while she slept brought an unexpected comfort. She thanked him softly for coming and admitted that she had been wondering who the mysterious visitor might be. Samuel gave a quiet nod and then hesitated before adding something else. He explained that when he first arrived on the evening of her surgery, he had actually spoken briefly with her son Daniel by telephone. According to Samuel, Daniel had mentioned that he was extremely busy with work obligations and would not be able to travel to Chicago immediately. Daniel had asked Samuel, as an old friend of the family, to stop by occasionally and make sure his mother was recovering well. Eleanor absorbed the information silently while the monitor continued its steady rhythm beside her bed. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, yet something about it left a faint question lingering in her thoughts. Daniel had not mentioned asking anyone to check on her. Still, the warmth of Samuel's quiet presence in the room made the hospital feel far less lonely than it had the night before, and for the first time since the surgery, Eleanor Brooks felt that someone nearby truly cared whether she recovered safely. Samuel Carter remained beside the chair for a while longer that evening, speaking quietly with Eleanor Brooks as the soft hum of the hospital machines continued to fill the room. The conversation moved slowly, not because either of them lacked words, but because both seemed to understand that Eleanor still needed rest more than anything else. Samuel asked simple questions about how she was feeling, whether the doctors had explained the recovery process clearly, and whether she had everything she needed during the day. Eleanor answered honestly, explaining that the surgery had left her tired but hopeful. The doctors believed her heart would grow stronger over the next few months, as long as she followed the rehabilitation plan carefully. Samuel listened with quiet attention, nodding occasionally as though he were memorizing every detail. Eventually, he glanced at the clock on the wall and realized the hour had grown late. Before leaving, he placed the small bouquet of lilies closer to the window so the morning light would reach them, then wished Eleanor a peaceful night of sleep. When the door closed behind him, the room felt calmer rather than empty, as if his quiet presence had somehow steadied the air around her. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to bright sunlight stretching across the floor tiles and the faint scent of the lilies beside her bed. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, she noticed that the room did not feel quite as lonely. During breakfast, she found herself replaying the conversation from the night before, particularly the moment when Samuel had mentioned speaking with her son Daniel. The explanation still sounded reasonable, yet something about it lingered in her mind. Daniel had always been busy with work, especially since he had taken on a leadership role at his company in Denver. Still, it felt unusual that he would ask someone else to watch over his mother without mentioning it to her directly. Eleanor picked up her phone and sent Daniel a message asking how his week had been going. Within an hour, he responded politely, saying that business meetings had kept him traveling between several cities and that he hoped she was recovering comfortably. His message was warm but brief, ending with a promise that he would call when his schedule allowed. Eleanor read the message twice before setting the phone down again. She could not decide whether the reply felt caring or distant. Throughout the afternoon, nurses came and went, adjusting medication and checking the monitors while Eleanor practiced slow breathing exercises the physical therapist had recommended. Each hour passed quietly until evening returned once more. As darkness settled outside the window, Eleanor noticed herself watching the door again, curious whether Samuel would return. At exactly 10:15 that night, the door opened just as gently as before. Samuel stepped inside carrying a small paper bag from a nearby cafe. He explained with a warm smile that he had brought fresh herbal tea, knowing that hospital coffee was rarely enjoyable. Eleanor laughed softly at the thoughtful gesture and thanked him as he poured the tea carefully into the cup beside her bed. As they spoke that evening, the conversation moved beyond simple questions about her health. Samuel mentioned that he had once admired how Eleanor had supported Robert during the early years of the construction company when money had been uncertain and long workdays had been common. Eleanor listened with quiet surprise, realizing that Samuel remembered details from decades earlier that even some family members had forgotten. Before leaving, Samuel paused for a moment and shared one more thought that gently unsettled Eleanor's mind. He said that during his brief phone conversation with Daniel several nights earlier, Daniel had sounded more concerned about certain paperwork related to Eleanor's finances than about her recovery itself. Samuel did not explain further, but the comment stayed with Eleanor long after the door closed again. As she lay awake beneath the soft hospital lights, the quiet gratitude she felt towards Samuel slowly blended with a new and unexpected question about why her son seemed more focused on documents than on the health of the mother who had always supported him. The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky stretching over Chicago, and the soft winter light drifted quietly through the tall hospital window as Eleanor Brooks slowly woke to the gentle beeping of the monitor beside her bed. For several moments she lay still, staring at the ceiling while the conversation from the night before replayed clearly in her mind. Samuel Carter had not spoken harshly or made any accusations, yet the single comment he shared about her son Daniel's interest in financial paperwork had left a subtle unease resting in her thoughts. Eleanor had always trusted Daniel. She had spent most of her life making sure he never felt unsupported, even during the difficult years after Robert passed away. When Daniel struggled to grow his consulting business in Denver, Eleanor had quietly helped him more than once by offering financial guidance and small investments that she had never mentioned to anyone else. Remembering those years now made Samuel's remark feel strange and unexpected. Later that morning, a physical therapist helped Eleanor walk slowly along the hospital hallway for the first time since the surgery. Each careful step reminded her that recovery would take patience, but the movement also cleared her thoughts. After returning to her room, she sat beside the window for a while, watching the quiet flow of traffic several floors below, while the question in her mind gradually became stronger. If Daniel truly had asked Samuel to check on her recovery, why had he never mentioned it directly to her? By early afternoon, Eleanor decided to call someone who might help her understand the situation more clearly. She scrolled through the contacts on her phone until she found the name of Margaret Whitaker, the family attorney who had managed Robert's estate years earlier. Margaret had always been meticulous, calm, and deeply trustworthy. When Eleanor called, Margaret answered with warm concern and immediately asked about her recovery. After a few minutes of conversation, Eleanor gently asked whether any documents related to her personal accounts had been discussed recently. Margaret paused for a moment before responding carefully. She explained that several weeks earlier Daniel had contacted her office requesting general information about the legal process for managing financial responsibilities if a parent became unable to handle paperwork independently. Margaret had assumed Daniel was simply planning responsibly for the future, something many families eventually discussed as parents grew older. Eleanor listened quietly as Margaret explained that no official changes had been made to Eleanor's accounts, and that any legal transfer of authority would require Eleanor's direct approval. After the call ended, Eleanor sat quietly beside the window again, absorbing the information. Daniel had been asking about financial control even before her surgery had taken place. The thought did not immediately make her angry. Instead, it stirred a quiet curiosity about what might have motivated the question. Perhaps Daniel was simply worried about her health and wanted to prepare responsibly. Yet when she remembered Samuel's calm observation the night before, the timing felt slightly unsettling. That evening, the hospital room once again filled with the dim glow of nighttime lights and the quiet rhythm of the medical equipment. Eleanor found herself less tired than she had expected, her thoughts focused more clearly than they had since the surgery. Just as before, the door opened gently a few minutes after 10:15 and Samuel Carter stepped inside carrying another small bag from the cafe across the street. He greeted Eleanor warmly and asked how her strength felt after the day's physical therapy. As they spoke, Eleanor decided to share the conversation she had just had with Margaret Whitaker. Samuel listened carefully without interrupting, his thoughtful expression unchanged. When Eleanor finished, Samuel nodded slowly and said that he had suspected something similar might be happening. He explained that Daniel's voice during their earlier telephone conversation had sounded more focused on timelines and signatures than on Eleanor's health itself. Samuel made it clear that he did not believe Daniel intended harm, but he also suggested that Eleanor should take her time reviewing any financial documents if they were ever presented to her. Eleanor appreciated the calm advice. For the first time, she realized that Samuel's quiet visits were not only acts of kindness, but also moments of careful observation from someone who understood how easily complicated decisions could appear during vulnerable times. As the evening continued, Eleanor Brooks began to feel a quiet determination, replacing the uncertainty that had filled her mind earlier. Recovery would take patience, but she would also make sure that every decision about her future would remain exactly where it belonged, in her own careful hands. The following morning arrived with a soft blanket of clouds drifting across the Chicago skyline, and Eleanor Brooks noticed that the hospital room felt different than it had only a few days earlier. The steady beeping of the heart monitor still echoed gently through the quiet space, but the sense of isolation that had once filled the room had gradually faded. Eleanor had slept more peacefully than she expected, and when she woke she found herself thinking less about the surgery and more about the conversations she had been having each evening with Samuel Carter. Those quiet visits had given her something she had not realized she needed during recovery: clarity. After breakfast, the doctor returned to review her progress and explained that her heart was responding well to the procedure. If everything continued as expected, she could likely return home within several days and continue rehabilitation through outpatient visits. Eleanor listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about medication schedules and physical therapy routines. She had always believed that understanding details helped people remain in control of their lives, and now that belief felt even more important. Once the doctor left, Eleanor sat beside the window watching the slow movement of traffic along the streets below. Her thoughts returned to the phone call she had made to Margaret Whitaker the previous day and the information Margaret had shared about Daniel's inquiries regarding financial authority. Eleanor did not feel angry toward her son. Instead, she felt a quiet determination to make sure that every decision about her future remained clear and deliberate. That afternoon, she placed another call to Margaret Whitaker and asked whether it would be possible to review her existing estate documents once she returned home. Margaret agreed immediately and said she would prepare updated copies so Eleanor could examine everything calmly. The conversation ended with Margaret reassuring her that there was no urgency and that Eleanor's recovery should remain the priority. When evening arrived once again, the hospital hallway settled into its familiar quiet rhythm. Nurses moved softly between rooms while the city lights outside the window slowly replaced the fading sunset. Eleanor noticed that she now expected the gentle turn of the door handle at the same time each night. At 10:15 precisely, the door opened and Samuel Carter stepped inside with the same calm presence he had shown every evening before. This time he carried 2 small cups of herbal tea and placed one carefully on the tray beside Eleanor's bed. He asked how the doctor's visit had gone and listened attentively while she described the progress of her recovery. When she mentioned her second conversation with Margaret Whitaker, Samuel gave a thoughtful nod and said that planning ahead often prevented misunderstandings later. Eleanor appreciated the steady practicality of his advice. As their conversation continued, Samuel shared a story about Robert from many years earlier when the construction company had faced a difficult contract dispute. Samuel explained how Robert had remained calm and patient until every document had been reviewed carefully, refusing to rush into decisions that could not be undone. Hearing the story made Eleanor smile softly because it reminded her how deliberate Robert had always been. That same sense of careful judgment now seemed to guide her own thinking. Before leaving, Samuel paused beside the window and looked out at the lights stretching across the Chicago skyline. He said that Robert had once told him that Eleanor possessed the same quiet strength that kept families steady during uncertain times. Samuel added that he believed Robert had been right. Eleanor felt a warm gratitude at those words, not only because they honored her late husband's memory, but also because they reminded her that she was not as alone as she had felt when she first arrived at the hospital. After Samuel left for the night, Eleanor leaned back against the pillow and looked toward the lilies resting beside the window. Their soft fragrance filled the room while the heart monitor continued its steady rhythm. For the first time since the surgery, she felt certain that the days ahead would not simply be about recovering physical strength. They would also be about making thoughtful decisions that ensured her future remained exactly where it belonged, guided by her own calm judgment and the quiet wisdom she had carried throughout her life. 2 days later, the morning sunlight entering Eleanor Brooks's hospital room carried a different kind of energy. The doctor arrived shortly after 8 o'clock with encouraging news that her recovery had progressed exactly as expected. Her heart rhythm remained stable, her strength was improving each day, and the surgical team believed she would be ready to leave St. Mary's Medical Center within 48 hours if everything continued smoothly. Eleanor listened carefully while the doctor explained the instructions she would need to follow once she returned home. She would continue taking medication each morning and evening, walk short distances every day to rebuild stamina, and attend a weekly cardiac rehabilitation program only 10 miles from her house in Evanston. Eleanor thanked the doctor sincerely and felt a quiet sense of relief as he left the room. After several days surrounded by hospital equipment and constant monitoring, the thought of returning to her own living room and the familiar view of Lake Michigan brought a calm comfort to her mind. Later that afternoon, Eleanor spoke again with Margaret Whitaker, confirming that they would meet at Eleanor's home the following week to review her financial documents and estate plan together. Margaret assured her that everything could be examined carefully and that there was no reason to rush any decisions. The calm professionalism in Margaret's voice reassured Eleanor that she was taking the right approach. That evening, when the hallway lights dimmed and the hospital floor grew quiet, Eleanor once again waited for the familiar soft sound of the door opening. Samuel Carter entered at the usual time carrying a small container of fresh soup from the cafe across the street. He explained with a gentle smile that hospital food rarely helped anyone regain strength quickly. Eleanor laughed softly and thanked him while describing the news about her expected discharge. Samuel seemed genuinely pleased and said that Robert would have been proud to see how calmly she had handled the past few days. The two spoke for nearly an hour that evening, reflecting on memories from decades earlier when Robert had first started his construction company and Eleanor had managed the household finances with remarkable discipline. Samuel mentioned that Robert had often said Eleanor understood the true value of patience and planning better than anyone he knew. Those words lingered warmly in Eleanor's mind after Samuel eventually stood to leave. The following afternoon, Eleanor received a brief message from her brother Michael showing a photograph of the Cancun beach glowing under bright sunlight. He wrote that the trip had been relaxing and that their parents were enjoying every moment of the warm weather. Eleanor responded kindly, telling him she was glad the vacation had brought them joy. She did not mention the hospital discharge scheduled for the next morning. That evening, Samuel returned once more with the same quiet presence that had become a steady part of Eleanor's recovery. They spoke about ordinary things such as the changing weather and the view of the lake near Eleanor's home. At one point, Samuel mentioned that he had driven past Eleanor's neighborhood earlier that day and noticed the maple trees beginning to change color as autumn approached. The simple image made Eleanor smile because she could almost picture the familiar street outside her house. Before leaving that night, Samuel paused beside the window and told Eleanor that he believed she would soon return to the calm rhythm of her normal life. Eleanor watched the city lights beyond the glass while his words settled gently in her thoughts. For days she had been surrounded by uncertainty, quiet questions, and the slow realization that not every concern within a family was always spoken openly. Yet, as she prepared to leave the hospital, she felt something stronger than worry. She felt clarity. The recovery from surgery had given her time to reflect, to listen carefully, and to remember the lessons she and Robert had built their lives upon. Decisions should never be rushed, trust should always be balanced with awareness, and true support often appeared in the quiet actions of those who expected nothing in return. As the heart monitor continued its steady rhythm beside her bed that final night in the hospital, Eleanor Brooks understood that the coming days would reveal much more than simply how strong her heart had become. The morning Eleanor Brooks left St. Mary's Medical Center, the air over Chicago carried the cool clarity of early autumn, and the sunlight reflecting off the glass buildings downtown felt brighter than it had in days. A nurse helped her gather the small collection of personal belongings she had brought with her, while the discharge papers rested neatly on the tray table beside the bed where she had spent the past week recovering. Eleanor moved slowly but steadily as she changed into her coat and comfortable shoes, grateful for the strength returning to her body with each careful step. When the hospital wheelchair carried her through the quiet hallway toward the front entrance, she noticed how different the world looked compared to the night she had first arrived. The uncertainty that had once filled her thoughts had been replaced by a calm sense of awareness. Outside the main doors, Samuel Carter stood waiting beside his car, just as he had promised the evening before. The cool breeze moved gently across the street as he helped Eleanor settle into the passenger seat, placing her small bag carefully in the back. The drive north toward Evanston was quiet and comfortable, passing familiar neighborhoods where trees were beginning to show the first hints of orange and gold. Eleanor watched the streets through the window, feeling the simple pleasure of returning to ordinary life. When they arrived at her home, Samuel walked her slowly to the front door and waited while she unlocked it. The house felt peaceful and still inside, the same soft sunlight falling across the living room where framed photographs of Robert and their early years together rested on the shelves. Eleanor thanked Samuel sincerely for everything he had done during her recovery. Samuel responded with the same calm kindness he had shown all week, saying that helping an old friend's family was simply the right thing to do. Before leaving, he reminded Eleanor to focus on rest and to take her time reviewing any documents that might appear in the coming weeks. Eleanor assured him she would do exactly that. 3 days later, the quiet rhythm of her home life had begun to return. She walked slowly along the sidewalk each morning as the doctor recommended, and the fresh air from Lake Michigan helped rebuild her strength. Margaret Whitaker visited on the 4th day, carrying a neatly organized folder containing Eleanor's financial records, property documents, and the original estate plan Eleanor and Robert had created years earlier. The two women sat at the dining table reviewing each page carefully, while the afternoon sunlight moved slowly across the room. Margaret explained that nothing in Eleanor's accounts had changed, and that any legal authority over her assets would require a formal document signed willingly by Eleanor herself. Eleanor thanked her and asked Margaret to update a few details so that everything remained clear and secure. The meeting ended with both women confident that the arrangements reflected Eleanor's wishes precisely. 2 days later, Eleanor received a phone call from Daniel. His voice sounded energetic as he explained that he would soon be traveling through Chicago for business and hoped to stop by briefly to check on her recovery. Eleanor welcomed the idea warmly and told him the door was always open. When Daniel arrived that weekend, he greeted his mother with a polite embrace and commented that she looked stronger than he expected. They sat together in the living room speaking about ordinary things for several minutes until Daniel eventually mentioned that during health scares it was often helpful for families to prepare documents that allowed adult children to help manage financial responsibilities if necessary. Eleanor listened calmly as he spoke, recognizing the same careful language Margaret Whitaker had described earlier. When Daniel finished explaining, Eleanor smiled gently and walked to the dining table where Margaret's updated folder rested neatly beside a vase of fresh flowers. She opened the folder and showed Daniel the completed estate plan that Margaret had finalized only 2 days earlier. The documents clearly confirmed that Eleanor retained full authority over every financial decision and that any future changes would occur only when she personally chose to make them. Daniel read the first page quietly, then nodded as if understanding the message without needing further explanation. Eleanor did not raise her voice or accuse him of anything. Instead, she simply closed the folder and returned it to the table, saying that she had always believed the best way to protect a family's future was through careful planning and patience. The conversation soon returned to lighter topics, and before leaving, Daniel wished her continued health. That evening, Eleanor sat beside the living room window, watching the sunset reflect across the lake in the distance. Her heart felt stronger with each passing day, but the greater change had taken place in her understanding. During the quiet nights in the hospital, she had learned that genuine support often arrived quietly, without expectation or recognition. Samuel Carter had appeared when she needed reassurance, while her own reflections had reminded her that wisdom came not from reacting quickly, but from observing patiently. As the last light faded over the water, Eleanor Brooks felt grateful not only for the recovery of her health, but also for the clarity that had followed. Some lessons arrive slowly, yet once they were understood, they strengthened the heart in ways that no surgery alone could ever accomplish.